design is really important. I mean, much of what we think of as science and as research is more kind of this descriptive, explaining the mechanisms and the fundamental constituting parts of the world. But there is a lot of stuff that is designed in the world, and it's just you look around at the life and the world we live in. Almost everything is the result of some sort of intentional design in light of course, circumstances. So even human beings redesign themselves. These two Russian brothers who want to be beautiful have tried and failed, I would say. Firms, of course, are also designed. Everything from Amazon to IKEA are the way they are as a result of an intentional and very complex design process as well. Our universities are being designed and are being challenged by other education providers that are also being designed in light of technological affordances and the demand, etc. To spend some time thinking about design and artifacts, and in particular thinking about entrepreneurship and innovation processes as design processes, I think is well worthwhile doing. I was toying around with trying to map our presenters on this spectrum here, and I realized that was really, really hard. Where should I put people? And the interesting thing, of course, is that everyone is kind of moving about as well. So no one stays in one lane. People sometimes do some consulting, sometimes do more descriptive work. Sometimes you write perhaps a book for practitioners, or just in an outlet like Harvard Business Review or something similar. I think trying to figure out what these concepts mean, how they relate to one another, and how to actually do design research is what we are gonna try to think a bit more deeply about during these 2 days.
There was this particular issue, this idea that you are making in the world, right? Which is something that Henrik referred to in connection with Herbert Simon, that where you are designing within the world, within the constraints of the natural world. So it's some kind of technology development view of making things. And from that, I had to move the conversation in some way to the idea of world making. That is where we actually bring in the designer, and the designer is part of the world, but they can remake the designer as well as the new world. So the purpose of design became more central. So in my conversations with Herbert Simon, we would talk about this a little bit, right? That especially in terms of when he describes the science of design or the sciences of the artificial as normative, that's something about what ought we to be doing in that kind of thing. So the issue of where do those purposes come from, where do those goals come from, where does that was part of the conversation with him. But when I went out and started talking about work on effectuation and things like that, the movement from making in the world to world making was not an easy transition. It's one thing to know the science of, the computer science behind the iPhone, the hardware behind the iPhone, even the design behind a lot of these things. But at the end of the day, how do you take all that science and all that technology and kind of, it has to fit the human hand, right? So that is the idea of the interface. I just took it that to the human realm, and I ask myself, my perspective is really about interactions, right? So when you think about two people talking to each other, there's something interesting here. So when you think about the inner environment and the outer environment, and the interface being the sciences of the artificial being the science of the interface, the way Simon was talking, I asked the same question: what is the interface when two people are talking to each other? And the interesting thing is you actually have an interface between two inner environments here. And you also have two sets of values and purposes and tastes and preferences. But the idea here is to really think about interfaces and interactions and go back and forth between the two. That's the way I've been thinking about world making. That's the way I've been thinking about design. That's the way I've been thinking about the notion of the artificial.
I want to spend more time on the performative approaches, which kind of, I think if you look at more recent pieces of work, including Henrik's piece in AMR on design, and Saras's work as she has been presenting it, they fall into these areas. So what is performativity? Why should we be concerned? I was initially attracted to the notion of performativity through John Austin's work of saying is doing. And the saying is doing is, it's a constituted world. And what that means is, in the very act of saying something, you're trying to do something. So the example is, I pronounce you man and wife, and so then you're married. So a new world begins, or I enact a new law. That saying is doing. So I think entrepreneurship, to be seen from that point of view, is rather interesting, that in the very saying of things, you're actually doing things. The other side of performativity, so one side is John Austin and the philosophical positions, Derrida, John Searle, where that comes from. The other side of it is in the doing of things. And it also connects with Herbert Simon's work clearly, of course, in the doing of things when he talks about oil paintings or Pittsburgh and on and on. But I'm kind of talking, I will just mention it from Karen Barad's work. And she says, doing is saying is the way I'm saying it at the moment. But she says the move towards performative alternatives to representationalism shifts the focus from questions of correspondence between descriptions and reality. Examples, do they mirror nature or culture, to matters of practices, doings, and actions. But going from representationalism to performativity, there's a shift. And Henrik rightly titled the first session as meta-theoretical, and so it is, like Sarah said, at a high level. But it is a shift from logico-scientific causal meaning to meaning making. And if you want to read something about this, Jerome Bruner is the best place to start. Two modes of thought. And you go away from individual agency to decentered agency, or distributed decentered agency. That means, it is not the individual who's deciding, but the agencement, the arrangements, which is allowing that person to decide, and the agencies in that. And operating in context to contextualizing. So there's a sense of determinism, when you operate in context, that the context determines something. But the flip side of that is that entrepreneurs contextualize using the bits and pieces around them. And from substance thinking, in which there are, people with identities and objects with given functions, to process metaphysics, which is that everything is in a flow and that things are materialized. And if you want to pursue that, I would recommend reading Rescher's work on process metaphysics. And there's a lot of discussion and debate around that. And from prediction to prospection. So most people think about prediction, accuracy, and all that when it comes to entrepreneurship. But I think when it comes to performativity, the questions and issues shift about the worlds in the making, as Saras was talking about. So I want to talk about meaning making at the moment, and just talk about very briefly the narrative approach, which initially caught my attention a long time ago when John C.D. Brown came and made a presentation at NYU. The narratives traffic in human possibilities rather than settled certainties, and permit discourse to acquire a meaning without this meaning becoming pure information. So there's a kind of a shift from information to interpretation, which is a kind of a major shift in my opinion. And then this is coming from Simon's work, the next one, which is the doing part of it. Engineering, medicine, business, architecture, and painting are concerned not with the necessary, but with the contingent, not with how things are, but with how things might be, in short, with design. And so this is the sciences of the artificial, which Henrik was talking about earlier.
So problem solving is an established perspective that we have been using for quite some time to investigate managerial phenomena. In innovation, it's a mainstream conceptualization of the innovation processes as creative problem solving, but also in strategy and entrepreneurship, we have seen a growing number of significant contributions. But I dare to say that the focus of practitioners and scholars has been traditionally on the solving part of the equation, based on the notion that you create value, you solve complexity, you make the magic by identifying a brilliant solution to a given problem. We think that the shift, the focus is shifting towards problem finding for a number of reasons. On one hand, we could claim that solutions are in great supply today thanks to crowdsourcing or open innovation platforms. And on the other hand, problems are increasingly wicked. In the age of artificial intelligence, problem solving is increasingly delegated to machines, while problem finding remains inherently human. Now, a focus on problem finding as opposed to problem solving is nothing new. It was part of a very interesting debate by two great thinkers in design and psychology, Simon and Csikszentmihalyi, already in the 80s. Two different views. One, Simon saying that at the end, problem finding is just another step in problem solving, one that is basically reducible to rational heuristics, and as such it could be replicated by computer models, while Csikszentmihalyi say that is instead a completely different kind of activity and effort, where basically human energetics, using Piaget words, affective and motivational factors play a key role, and that makes them makes problem finding hardly replicable by computer models. I mean, these distinctions might work also for problems, because on the left you have the notion that problems are out there, they have their own existence, and the job of the innovator is try to create a map of the problem, all its different elements and connections, and find a path to the right problem, the best problem to be solved. And so problems as a treasure to be discovered, and the key for the innovator is seeing what others haven't seen yet. They could have, but they haven't. So here you do problem diagnosis. You are within a quite bounded problem space defined by a number of requirements, and it's kind of a static map of the problem, a good picture of it, but not so much taking into account a context that changes. On the right, instead, we have problem design. So basically the innovator constructing a problem, not the right problem, a problem that is more meaningful to solve. In fact, this is more of an inside-out perspective, where the innovator feels some kind of malaise with the status quo, feels like the ingrained assumptions in an industry, for example, are unfit to a context that has eventually changed. So what the innovator does is tries to explore the possibility of the problem. So asking, why does it matter? Why is it relevant? So it's not digging deep into the root causes of the problem, but rather elevating the problem, connecting to fundamental aspects of the human experience. So what the innovator does is really trying to find the right, a proper frame to the problem, seeing it in a different light, connecting different contexts together, and hopefully finding fit between her purpose and the kind of change she wants to bring to the world in a world that changes.
What we are interested in here is, in particular, is what entrepreneurs do when they frame, so the framing practice of design. And our claim is that, I mean, we are reflecting on this, so we are not expert in the field, but our frame is that Simon's framework is not the only framework to understand design, especially when it comes to the activity of framing. I would say the practice and the framework of Simon's is very good to describe how engineers design, very far to describe how real designers design. we believe that problem finding as reframing, as really a Csikszentmihalyi say, is not a peculiar case of problem solving. It's not one of the steps of problem solving, but it's really orthogonal and probably even opposite in terms of mindset.
But the point from design theory is to wonder whether there is something very specific in designing in situation of entrepreneurship. And that's what I would like to discuss with you. And the surprise of this investigation is that finally, it's not really the question of being strongly creative or original that is specific to design and entrepreneurship, but finally, it's much more the intention of building something strong and transmittable, something that is not only an asset, but an asset that could even be useful for further creation. That's what we call a creation heritage. And the hypothesis is that in entrepreneurship as design, finally, the great challenge for design theorists is to understand what does it mean to design a creation heritage. And again, we see here a tension between the fact that you will explore, but you want to make it real. It's not just abstract discussion. We want to have in the end products, services, changes in the society. So the surprise that if you look at this, there is both innovation and the logic of being real and preserve what exists. So the surprising thing is that finally, there is something very specific in entrepreneurship as design, seen from design theory, of course. It's not this kind of design we could have in bricolage, tips and tricks. We want to change the world. It's not pure utopic exploration. We want to make it true, to realize it. It's not incremental development. It's not only that we optimize existing products, we want to go beyond this. And it's not moon landing because we have limited resources. We have to do this in a limited time. So again, when we look at this, there is something specific, this combination of innovation and preservation, constraints following the constraints of the real world.
Thank you, Pascal. I guess my point is more political. I would really like to influence you researchers, okay, to start research on ethical questions. But because if we take the language of entrepreneurial opportunities from the perspective, let's say, of Shane and Venkat and most research on entrepreneurship, which take this model as the background picture, then in my opinion, we reinforce a false picture of humanity and of human beings. On the other hand, if we take the postmodern existential entrepreneurs can, some kind of romantic postmodern heroes that they can create some kind of value out of nothing, it's also, in my opinion, very problematic. We need to understand individuals in the context of relationships.
My take on various kinds of theories is that, different theories have different virtues, right? They have different things that they're good at. There are different things that different theories aim to accomplish. So if you take, Shane and Venkat or others who adopt concepts from economics to describe entrepreneurship as a kind of matching of individual and environmental circumstances, that has certain virtues. It's very simple. You can discuss it in terms that have a theoretical tradition in economics that you can borrow from, etc. Not very strong on ethics.
Your comments about ethics was also to some large extent about how do we bring about the solutions and who do these solutions affect, and other problems that we are addressing, the problems that are relevant for most parts or the people, the stakeholders that we have to involve in the process. And I think there, the idea of how can we create and make entrepreneurship a more relational process.
The second comment I want to make is about what Thomas just now said. From a performative point of view, it is not an individual who is deciding what is ethical or not. The problem is that there are multiple actors involved from their own context, and they all come with different value propositions.
So I think the idea of bringing into ethics could be a way for us to start thinking about reformulating problems in terms of things that we do not see normally, or we do not talk about. We don't think about who is not at the table.
Precisely what we're talking about now, how design is wrapped up with values and ethics, and how design involves issues of meaning. I mean, Roberto's old work on designing meaning of both in products and in other contexts. That to make sense of that type of thing, it's important to reflect on what it is to be a human being, and how one relates to the world, and what meaningful behavior is, and all that type of stuff. So I think there is great, I mean, to the extent that this whole design approach to entrepreneurship takes hold, I think that is a discussion that needs to be had, that type of kind of philosophical grounding. And I think Saras, you spoke a bit about it. Raghu was clearly, latching onto those types of discussions, and so there's absolutely room for that type of publication. I think it's even very important, I would say.